Jesus actively countered patriarchy. Today, we are looking at two stories of psychosomatic healings through which Jesus at the time counters patriarchal rule. The first is known as the story of the woman with the issue of blood, which we can call more appropriately the story of the woman who is bleeding away. And the second story, which frames the first one, is the story of the daughter of Gyrus, a high-ranking religious official. Greetings and welcome to this lecture series on a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible, developed by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books, using insights from psychology, philosophy, poetry, and the sciences to help us read these biblical stories and stories of classical literature, world literature, fairy tales, as stories of our own lives. As we look at these two stories today, I want to say a couple of things at the outset about Drewermann's method of interpretation, his exegetical methodology, as scholars call it. But this is not just an academic affair. It decides whether who determines what the biblical stories mean. It decides whether you and I have a say in this, or whether it is just a matter of experts, scholars, scribes, or religious officials claiming to know and ruling these truths from up high down. Drewermann, his name is spelled like Drew and then E-R-M-A-N-N, argues that it is essential for understanding healing stories in the Bible to listen to people's experience today who present with very similar psychosomatic difficulties. In fact, Drewermann's interpretations in his commentaries on the Gospels and other biblical stories, and especially of the healing and miracle stories, are always informed by the experiences his patients have shared with him in their psychotherapeutic and spiritual care conversations. Throughout his life, he led between 10 to 20 hours of psychotherapeutic conversations each week. He draws on the experience of people to understand the experiences of the people portrayed in the gospel stories and in other biblical stories. And he argues that exegetes, meaning the academics that try to interpret what these stories mean, and theologians in general should draw in one way or another on these deep experiences of people as well. Now, when I use the word psychosomatic, that refers to that our mental state, our mind, can have an impact on how our body feels. And so these stories have this kind of impact, Drewermann argues. Just as other social liberation theologies read biblical stories as stories addressing the same kinds of struggles for freedom from oppression that marginalized people today experience, Drewermann reads biblical stories in his therapeutic theology of liberation as narratives addressing the same kinds of emotional and spiritual struggles for personhood that we all in one way or another experience. The stories thus address what has been marginalized in all of us in various forms, and what we have, often in compliance with outside pressures, marginalized in ourselves. In line with that, both stories are about people who lose their vitality, their life, because they are not allowed to be who they are and to take from life what they truly need and want. In his first published account of these two sandwiched stories, which was published in this book, it's in German, and I will work on a translation of this, Depth Psychology and Exegesis, Volume 2, which deals with miracles, visions, prophecies, apocalypses, narrative stories, and parables, published in 1985, the second volume. The first one was published in 1984. Drewermann states that on the backdrop of a patriarchal society, a, quote, society ruled by men, the story narrates the fate of two women, one of whom has been suffering incurably for 12 years from having to live as a woman, namely in that society, while the other one is about to lose her life just at the moment when, at the age of 12, she begins to become a woman. The question is, therefore, to ask from both temporal poles, adulthood and childhood, of mental development, how one can live as a woman, or rather how to identify positively with the role of a woman, unquote, within a society ruled by men. And I continue in another passage of that first account that Drewermann developed, quote, that is without doubt the central problem of the bleeding woman. But it is important to assume a similar problem with the daughter of Gyrus as well. For given such an inner relationship, we can understand the inversely symmetrical relationship that emerges step by step between the bleeding woman and the daughter of Gyrus in this narrative. While the bleeding woman goes from doctor to doctor in order to be healed, the daughter of Gyrus from within is apparently not able to contribute anything to her recovery. While the bleeding woman seeks out Jesus in order to touch him unnoticed, Jesus himself must seek out the daughter of Jairus in order to touch this already dead woman, separated from the crowd by the laying on of hands, while the bleeding woman herself has to make her way through the bulky crowd. Jesus is faced with the task of shaking off the obstructive mourners. Both healings are directly parallel to each other, in that they take place as if in secret and are communicated to the public only after the fact, whereby the woman has to announce her healing precisely publicly, while Jesus imposes a commandment of silence on the healing of Jairus' daughter. Such consistently carried out parallelization of all individual movements only makes sense if one understands it, and this is methodologically, by the author of the stories, if that was their intention to put these two stories together, as a request and interpretation instruction to regard the life of the bleeding woman and the life of the daughter of Jairus as belonging internally together. That is, one must understand from a psychological perspective the healing of the bleeding woman as a counterpart to the healing of the daughter of Jairus, and vice versa. Only together and in mutual complementation do both female figures illuminate the facets of one and the same problem: how one can live as a woman in the midst of a society of men and find a certain degree of happiness and health. Drewermann adds, again methodologically, that is, as an explanation for how to interpret a story like this, quote, "What must appear in historical critical exegesis," that is the traditional reading of the Bible through the lens of historical research, again and again. So what must appear in historical critical exegesis again and again, like a tradition historical or redaction historical puzzle. These are two terms that belong specifically to historical critical research. One dealing with what traditions, what did the writers pick up before that went into the story, and then redaction historical, meaning what did the writer actually do with these stories that the writer already got. So start again. What must appear in historical critical exegesis, again and again, like a tradition historical or redaction historical puzzle, shows itself in depth psychological perspective, often as an integral condensation of conflicts and solutions that find precisely in this way their most vivid expression and their enduring valid truth. And another quote from a purely, and this concludes the quotations that I will have from depth psychology and exegesis, and then I will go into the actual story. But in this quote, Drewermann gives an example from his psychotherapeutic practice of a woman who experiences basically the very same thing as the bleeding woman in this story. But he prefaces it with a reflection on how things led up to this. So here, from a purely external point of view, this is the quote now, the disease of the bleeding woman can be diagnosed with some degree of certainty. It is likely to be an abnormality of the female period. Menorrhagia is the technical term, and I am pausing a little bit here because English is not my first language, so some of these technical terms are sometimes more difficult to express. So menorrhagia, which Frederick Fenner states in Illnesses in the New Testament, it's a book only available in German as far as I know, and that Drewermann quotes, is often hysterical in nature and then psychologically suggestible. That's a quote from Fenner. Now Drewermann adds here, but the same superstition prevails in medicine that has now devastated large parts of theology. That it would be enough to explain and terminologically designate a phenomenon at an objective distance in order to come closer to a person in a healing way, instead of an empty and distancing magic of words. So just remember here, Fenner called this hysterical in nature. And the other technical term that we heard about a prolonged female period. So instead of an empty and distancing magic of words, it is much more important to understand what an illness communicates of the life and experience of a human being, to which needs and anxieties it responds, how it has itself an effect on one's own condition. In short, what fate manifests itself in a certain illness, all the way into the body. Above all, one must be careful not to declare human life in its richness of nuances to be a mere case for the application of laws already known, whether medical or psychological, or theological, and thus to overlook from the outset what the miracle narratives, for all their typicality and topicality, report again and again with such urgency. How an individual human being tries to live in and with her illness, how she wrestles with it and comes to terms with it, and how in all this she ultimately longs not for the health of the body, but for a love that brings her closer to God. Clues for such inner empathy abound in the story of the bleeding woman. So now he will go into the case, but first he introduces a typical scenario for the psychosocial development of the condition described in this story. The quote is this: psychoanalytically, one will generally have to think of the disease of bleeding as a character image within which the role as a woman, especially female sexuality, is experienced as a whole as something dirty, guilty, and shamefully harmful. Remember again, he's saying that this has to do with a patriarchal society. Almost always, such an impression stems from an extremely problematic relationship that a woman had with her father already as a girl, whom she must have loved as much as she feared him. Behind such an overly strong and highly ambivalent attachment to the father, however, there are regularly severe disappointments in the mother, whom one perceives as too weak and submissive to be able to assert herself in the face of the father's violent ways. In the language of Freud's psychoanalysis, the role of the woman under such circumstances appears to a girl as a kind of castration. And so she turns to the father in order to be secure in her fear from him, in her fear of him, and to become complete and whole again in her love for him despite all the wounding. Only from this general Oedipal syndrome, one can explain the anxiety and vulnerability in later years, but also the hope and expectation, which in the adult woman's experience will remain unchanged, attached to love. However, in order to induce specifically the pronounced symptom of bleeding, an additional triggering factor in the present experience is almost always required. Usually a severe disappointment, an emotional wounding in a love relationship that is perceived as extremely important. At least one example may be used to describe the psychodynamics and conflictual dynamic in this background of the symptomatology of bleeding in more detail. And so now Drewermann goes into this case. I will present the case, but I want to briefly state here, while Drewermann applies Freudian psychology, and this case really, as you will see, is conducive to using Freudian terminology, actually. There are other ways that one can interpret this that would lead to the same results that Drewermann has. And Drewermann uses many other psychologies in his works, all the way from Rogers' psychology, but also many different psychoanalytic psychologies, be it object relations, be it self-psychology, for those of you familiar with these technical terms, or relational psychology, even neuropsychoanalysis. So he is kept up with the development of psychoanalysis, but he often finds that in terms of religion, which is often structured patriarchally, that Freud's analyses of patriarchal structures are still very helpful. And it is in that sense that his interpretation of the Oedipal dynamics here are helpful, because they talk about how father and mother are internalized in relation to one's own experience of one's own sexuality. And so let me go into this case that he tells from his own practice. A woman, 36 years old, who has been suffering periodically from incessant menstrual bleeding for several years, tells in a childlike language that she had grown up as an only child with parents who, with their constant tensions and quarrels, had set a distinct example of fear and fear of any marital cohabitation. Nevertheless, she had no greater desire than to marry and have children of her own. Her career choice to study pedagogy and to become a teacher had also been motivated by this. Admittedly, she experienced the beginning of her studies and the departure from home as a relief, and initially followed other role expectations. A decisive crisis in her life occurred when, at the age of 30, she fell in love with a young man for about 3.5 years. She explains verbatim, this is what the woman herself said, quote, "He was tremendously fascinating to me, but he didn't really love me. He always wanted to make another woman out of me. He liked my appearance, that I was certainly presentable, but he didn't like my nature. The love for this man was a trauma. I was in pain for a year, and the bleeding didn't stop. I was in the hospital for it, but the doctors couldn't treat it. It was psychosomatic. I think when love stops, it's like everything contracts internally. I know many kinds of physical pain. They all go only up to a certain limit. But this pain never stops. One feels hurt to death. And I was relieved that it was bleeding so much. I wanted to die. I felt so small and wrong, like I was doing everything wrong. At the same time, I want someone to really accept me. But I dream too much. I'm alone too much. If I like men from afar, it works. And if I don't try at all, they're almost at my feet. But when I get closer to them, when I really love a man, I'm afraid of becoming a nuisance to him. Perhaps I demand too much and idealize love. After all, I want to help the other person and give him everything. But others say I'm too difficult, too complicated. My female colleague says, I just met the wrong man. But I don't think it's that simple. It's the end of the quote of her. And I continue with Drewermann's interpretation now, or description, further description. In fact, the bleeding stopped only when she fell in love with a second man. But he too dumped her after a year with the same reasoning that she was too difficult for him. And promptly the old suffering began again. What can a woman do who feels rejected as too complicated in the central area of her life, in the search for love? All her life, this woman had drawn from this reproach the conclusion that she should never again be a nuisance to another man. And as she tried to realize this decision in the only way, two ways possible. So she tried to realize this decision in the only two possible ways that she saw. First, by hiding deep within herself her own wounds, pains, and grievances, as if they were something shameful. And then secondly, by hoping to repay every deeper contact in which her soul could have made itself known. While Drewermann presents here a heterosexual woman, what he talks about could also be applied to homosexual women, lesbian women, to non-binary women. It's really not requiring a particular gender. It has more to do with internalized relationships. And these relationships could relate to father or mother, even though in this particular case, Drewermann emphasizes this woman's relationship with her father because this is also what the story talks about, in particular by having the story of Jairus' daughter sandwiched together with the healing of the bleeding woman. Now let us go into the detailed interpretation of both stories. And that is found in the second volume of this commentary, the commentary of the Gospel of Mark. And actually it's the first volume. We're still in the first volume. Next week we will go into the second volume. And the subtitle of this is Images of Redemption. And I'm preparing currently an English version for publication of this commentary. So stay tuned for that. In this commentary, Drewermann interprets these two stories separately, whereas in Depth Psychology and Exegesis, he emphasized how they are related. So he begins in the commentary with the story of the healing of the bleeding woman. Let us first listen to the story itself in Mark 5, verses 21 through 34. And then, I want to just tell you that the translation that you're hearing is my translation into English of Drewermann's translation of this text directly from the Greek. And of course, Drewermann translated that into German. So here is the story. The woman who is bleeding away. I translate this. beginning in verse 21, chapter 5 of the Gospel of Mark. And when Jesus, in the boat, had crossed over to the other side again, a large crowd gathered around him, and he was just then by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, comes, and as he sees him, falls at his feet and implores him, saying, "My little daughter is at the end. Come on, lay hands on her so that she may be saved and stay alive." Then he, meaning Jesus, went away with him, and a large crowd followed him, and they pressed in on him. And there was a woman, she had a flow of blood for already 12 years. She had suffered much from many doctors and had used up all her possessions, but nothing had benefited her. Instead, it had gotten worse. Instead, it had gotten worse with her. When she had heard about Jesus, she came in the crowd and touched his robe from behind. For she had said to herself, "Even if I only touch his garments, I will be saved." And immediately the flow of her blood dried, and she felt in her body that she was healed from the torturous disease. And immediately Jesus felt inwardly that power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my robes?" Then the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he looked around him to see who had done this. But the woman, terrified and trembling, knowing what was happening to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. But he said to her, "Daughter, your trust has saved you. Go in peace and be healthy without your torturous disease." And here is Drewermann's interpretation. As if to justify himself, Rainer Maria Rilke once prefaced one of his poem cycles, which is in Rilke's Book of Images, with a title page in which he explains why the 9 sheets that follow only paint images of distress and want to give language to the voices of misery. Beggars, drunkards, widows, the blind, lepers, little people, the whole litany of a vulnerable life society tolerates only on the margins, which looks somewhere for help and yet never knows where to find it. In this declaration, Rilke speaks of the pressure on the poor to reveal themselves. He writes, this is a quote from Rilke, "The rich and the lucky can afford to be silent. Nobody wants to hear their stories anyway." I'm reading from the published translation, but I want to point out here that this line that is translated as "nobody wants to hear their stories anyway," I think might be better translated, or alternatively translated, with "nobody wants to know what they are." but the wretched have to advertise themselves. My alternative translation would be have to reveal themselves. Have to say, I'm blind, or I'm about to become so, or nothing on earth works out for me. My alternative translation of this line would be, I'm not doing well on earth. Or I have a sick child, or here I am, all pieced together. And probably, I might say perhaps, even that won't be enough. And since otherwise people will pass them by, the way they pass things, I'll say that line again for emphasis, and since otherwise people will pass them by the way they pass things, they have to sing. And then you hear really good singing. People, though, are strange. They'd rather hear castrati sing in boys' choirs. Castrati. But God himself comes and stays a long time whenever these cut ones disturbed him. The literal translation would be these circumcised ones. Now comes Drewermann's thoughts on this poem that he uses here to illustrate. He writes, "The inaudible, soundless song of poverty pervades this world, composed of anxiously and shamefully hidden gestures of pleas, of carefully disguised and hidden expressions of distress, and furtive glances at the seemingly unattainable happiness of others. It is precisely people who are poorest who often feel most ashamed, because they experience every plea for help as a disgrace, as an embarrassment, as a shameless pauper's oath. They always feel that they have to hide and pretend, and therefore they say that their suffering is not so bad. They always fear that they will only be a burden to others with their sick being. How much they would like to look for a place where they would be allowed to communicate about themselves, but they almost never dare to do so. Thus, they are eventually all the more forced to reveal themselves to others as sick, to ask them for consideration, and to explain to them their own shameful state. As long as possible, they will try with all their strength to maintain a good impression to the outside world, a protective wall of modesty that they have painstakingly created, and to spare the other, as it were, the danger of being infected by their own self. Drewermann here uses the word ich, which means I or ego, but I think in English has more the connotation of self today. What if the others knew? Therefore, the mere request for help seems to already require time and again the art of disguise. Somewhat like this, we have to imagine the woman who comes to Jesus in the story of the Gospel of Mark, shy and bashful, after 12 years of an illness that secludes and separates her from all others as cultically impure. The suffering from the contradiction she lives in is excruciating. On the one hand, she has to tell everyone through words or behavior, don't come too close to me. Don't touch me. Don't let me infect you. By doing so, she in a sense has to evade the proximity of others again and again out of consideration. On the other hand is the incessant desire simply to belong and to be like the others. And then there is the endless string of hopes and disappointments. Maybe this doctor will succeed. Perhaps not today, but next time, in weeks or at least in months. Maybe there's an even better doctor out there, more expensive, but also more educated and capable. As if the entire existence could again have human dignity only if this disease, this scandalous flaw, no longer existed. That's how the woman feels, Drewermann is saying here. The woman, says Mark laconically, has spent everything to get healthy. She never came to terms with her condition. Rather, she became completely resigned because nothing got better. Rather, everything got worse. And how could it? Usually, such diseases are not purely physical occurrences. They're rather the expression of a mental attitude and are indeed often directly caused by it. And this picture of her illness apparently expresses particularly clearly what the woman feels inside. From a psychosomatic point of view, her illness is probably a kind of dysmenorrhea, induced by a strongly depressive attitude towards all things related to sexuality and love. Indeed, towards her role as a woman in general. And if you like to look up some research here that actually substantiates this view of the psychosomatic dimension of dysmenorrhea, there's an article in 2019 by Bajalan and others in the Journal of Psychosomatic Obstetrics and Gynecology that's called Mental Health and Primary Dysmenorrhea, a systematic review that confirms that this is a very real form of psychosomatic suffering. Drewermann, of course, is not quoting that. I wanted to give this to you as listeners. Drewermann wrote this in 1985 and points out to Fenner's book, but this is current research. To continue the interpretation. She, the woman, will have experienced everything that has to do with it, only as dirty or as guilt. I'll say that again for emphasis. She will have experienced everything that has to do with it, in quotation marks, only as dirty or as guilt, meaning her experience as a woman. And in any case, as damaging and embarrassing, really like a bleeding out. This is in quotation marks in Drewermann here, as if being a woman meant as much as flowing out and bleeding away, as having to spend oneself and constantly sacrificing one's substance without ever getting anything back in return. It must have been the basic feeling, the basic attitude of this bleeding woman to experience life like an ever progressing, unstoppable loss, a wearing oneself out without the slightest meaning and benefit. Accordingly, her illness must have expressed exactly what she experienced in relation to the doctors. That she had to give and give until everyone else became ever richer from her, yet she became ever poorer, ever more empty, ever more lonely. Just as an aside here, Drewermann is here pointing out that there is a transference here of what's going on with the woman in relation to the doctors. She's treating them, or she's relating to them in a way that actually tells us about what she's suffering from. She's giving herself aware. And of course, doctors in the story apparently are not realizing this and simply perpetuate that. So if one works psychologically, if one works therapeutically with a person like her, one would have to be aware of this way of depleting her, of playing into this dynamic of loss. I'll come back to Drewermann's words here. She herself was unable to end this vicious circle. She had to sacrifice ever more, because only in this way could she hope to become healthy one day. But she could never become healthy in this way, because her whole illness consisted precisely in the fact that she thought she had to pour out everything, her whole inner being, to others. And on top of that is this bashfulness and shyness to accept anything or to actively ask for something or even to demand it. Such contradictions were part of the picture of the illness, but they will have been strengthened by the illness itself. For although this woman likely must have always found it difficult to presume to take something in life for herself, she will certainly have considered it completely out of the question in this state, which made her impure, to have anything given to her, at least not for free, at least not as alms. She will, of course, have waited passively, with particular longing for someone to come into her life to whom she could unreservedly entrust and give herself without having to be afraid again. That something would be given to her for once without her having to do all kinds of things first, and that she would be allowed to touch someone who would remove the impurity from her body and from her existence. It is an altogether banal wisdom. The only means capable of healing people is love. A relationship completely independent and detached from questions of worthiness and unworthiness, of achievement and merit, independent even of the question of pure and impure. Simply a hand that one may extend without being rejected. Simply a touch that takes hold of nothing and claims nothing for itself, and which nevertheless connects two people with each other on the inside, as if a circuit were closed through which the energy of healing flows. But also vice versa, that within the other, within Jesus, something arises like a countercurrent that fulfills what this woman feels so much as emptiness in herself, a force that flows out from him and lets the outflow of the woman dry up. Often, one needs to know only a single scene in the life of a person, and then one already knows, in essence, who that person is. Basically, our life consists of only a few points that set the course. The space in between is filled by the established tracks of routine and habit. But these few moments of decision shape our life. In them, we are fully us. This in itself, fleeting encounter of the woman with Jesus, seems to have been such a moment of essential decision. We neither know her name nor her story, and yet we may assume that she probably always behaved as she does here. Just as an aside in terms of the method of interpretation, Drewermann writes in Depth Psychology and Exegesis, when he interprets this story, that what he's suggesting here, that a particular moment can represent a whole life, that is an example of the condensation rule. The rule that things that are significant in all of life can be condensed into a moment in a story. He defines it this way, that in particularly intense moments of life, when literally everything seems to be on the line, a person acts exactly according to their character. And so this woman does that in this way: anxious, shy, unable to take the initiative to speak to Jesus, extremely pressed in on among the many people, and yet driven by the desire to at least touch him from behind. That is not him, the hemline of his robe, a tiny piece of him. That would be all. In this furtive manner, she dares to make this contact, which looks like a coincidence and which outwardly cannot be distinguished at all from an unintentional touch. And yet, in this one movement lies the hope, the trust, and the affection of an entire life. Only because of this last piece is this current of power between her and Jesus created, so that the power of love that heals penetrates into the faith that moves the hands of this woman and into the trust that makes her fingers dare to touch. It is the first time that this woman no longer feels like hurt to be a woman. It is all the more important that her deed does not simply remain something furtively stolen. Søren Kierkegaard put it already correctly 180 years ago. And I updated 150 to 180 because this book was written in 1984. So Kierkegaard's quote that Drewermann quotes here: "As for the attitude of Christ, it may perhaps be interpreted in a somewhat different way than is usually done. He will not permit the secretive communication with him. He therefore draws her forward. This is understood as somewhat judgmental, but perhaps it is done precisely out of compassion, divine compassion, in order to show her that he is not apprehensive about a bleeding woman touching him and making him unclean. In Christ's place, a merely human being even if he could work miracles and had done so, would have shared the woman's interest in her remaining hidden. It was too much to ask of him that, in addition to everything else, he should expose himself to the people's judgment. So that's the contrast to what a human being typically would do and what Jesus actually did. That's the end of the quote that Drewermann takes here from Kierkegaard. This is in Kierkegaard's Journals and Notebooks, Volume 7. In fact, Drewermann continues, Jesus has the courage to expose the desperate audacity of this woman in front of everyone. He himself is not ashamed of her, nor does he want her to continue to be ashamed of her illness. The most courageous step of her life towards healing should no longer look like a sneaky theft. What you did, Jesus seems to want to say to her, was no guilt. It is a sign of your trust that without asking or seeking permission, you did and took what you needed to live. For this is precisely what God wants, and this is what God understands by faith, to overcome the anxiety and timidity that can, to the point of disease, deface and destroy life, and to set as certain that God wills our life. And even the wording of the law often seems to contradict that will. Go then, your faith has healed you. This is the end of the quote that Drewermann imagines Jesus saying, daughter, your trust has saved you. Go in peace and be healthy without your torturous disease. And now let us look at the second interpretation that Drewermann provides of the healing of the daughter of Jairus. Again, I will read first the text. Begins in verses 34 and goes through 43. So while he is still speaking, they come from the leader of the synagogue and say, your daughter has died. Why are you still bothering the master? But Jesus had overheard the conversation that was going on. Says to the leader of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only trust. And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Just as an aside here, you see how this is in exact contrast to the crowd gathered when Jesus is healing the woman. I continue with verse 38. When they come to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he notices a commotion as they weep and wail intensely. So he goes in and says to them, why are you making a loud commotion and weep? The child did not die. She is just sleeping. Then they laughed at him, but he threw them all out, takes the father of the child and the mother and his companions and goes in where the child was. And he grasped the hand of the child and tells her, Talita cum, which translates as, girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl arose and walked around, for she was already 12 years old. And immediately they were out of their minds with great ecstasy. And he instructed them strictly that no one should know this, and he ordered that they should give her something to eat. And here's Drewermann's interpretation. I think it should take maybe another 15 minutes. Can it be that a human life is over just as it begins? The story of Gyrus' daughter tells us of this possibility, but also of the way to overcome it. It is terrible that death has the power to take away the lives of people close to us very early, seemingly at will and when it pleases. And the sadness and pain that accompany the arrival of death are terrible. But it is even worse that the fear of death can suffocate a human life before it even has the possibility to blossom freely and independently into its own existence. And not infrequently, it is the supposed care of one's own parents that has this effect. It is possible, out of fear and worry, to put such a glass cover of protection and care over a child so that it suffocates under it. This is precisely what seems to have happened between the leader of the synagogue, Jairus, and his daughter. The so-called girl is 12 years old, as we learn at the end of the story. She is therefore just at the age when one becomes an adult, marriageable woman in ancient Israel. At this very moment, it happens that the little daughter of Gyrus, as we hear her referred to again and again, no longer knows how to live, but instead lies in her chamber as if dead. The impression is unavoidable that the two are related. The mollycoddling and belittling of her person and her fatal disease on entering adulthood. What becomes of a woman? What becomes of a human being when they are always spoken of only as the daughter or the son of the father? It is oppressive if a person's life is supposed to be defined only as a shadow image and phantom of what education, environment, and the influence of the formative prescription and years of the parents want to make of her or his life. Presumably, the existence of the daughter of the leader of the synagogue was much like the life of the children of village school teachers or Protestant pastors just a few decades ago. They had to be the pride, the showpiece, the model of parental education. Other children might romp and play outside or get up to all sorts of mischief, but the daughter of the leader of a synagogue had to be careful because one looks at them. If she embarrasses herself, she embarrasses her father. For quite a while, for years, this educational concept may seem to work without harm. Indeed, it may eventually become the pride of the daughter to be the pride of her father. Only on the verge of adulthood must this arrangement unfailingly prove to be what it is, an unending chain of anxiety and guilt feelings. On the one hand, the little daughter of Gyrus will never have learned to make her own decisions. The probability of doing something wrong is too great. The dependence, even obligation to be protected by the so faithfully caring father is still overpowering. On the other hand, however, like every child of her age, she will have felt the urge to unfold her own life. In her, too, the longing for love, the dreamy expectation of youthful fantasy, the will to protest and to rebel against too much control and paternalism will have made themselves known. Feelings of this kind cannot be suppressed, but for this very reason, they generate a constant fear of reproach and punishment. In this way, a life that grows only in the twilight of this kind of responsible care by parents turns into a fatal disease. Tragically, it is apparently incomprehensible to Father Gyrus how much he himself may be the actual cause of his daughter's life-threatening condition. Therefore, it probably must happen that Jairus' little daughter first has to die in order to come to life. On the way home, even Jesus has no other choice but to let Father Jairus be confronted with this limit of extreme loss in all its harshness, precisely under the eyes and hands of God. Only if she dies to her father will Jairus' daughter live. It is at this point, however, that one learns about Jairus' attitude in life something extraordinarily sad, ultimately despairing. Sabbath after Sabbath, this leader of the synagogue will have spoken the name of God. But now that the people tell him, "Your daughter is dead," one hears that all the members of his household, in truth, do not believe in God at all. Only the omnipotence of death appears to them as something ultimate and final. This is the point where it becomes quite clear with what kind of anxiety Jairus latently cared for the life of his daughter, as if it were the duty of a father to protect his child with all his might against death. In truth, with his attitude, the entire relationship between father and daughter turns deadly. If we understand love as an attempt to secure each other's earthly life and possibly to fight with absolute energy against the seemingly invincible power of death, then our life together inevitably turns into a terroristic, deadly practice of care, coercion, micromanagement, and suffocating constriction. This insight is very crucial. It is not possible for love to breathe if only earthly life exists, because love lives from freedom, from the opening of an infinite horizon, from the knowledge of the irreducibility, the eternity, the infinite greatness of the other whom one loves. Love is the strongest assurance that there is an eternal life. The story of Jairus' daughter shows first this most of all, that to the humanity of love, the daring of freedom, the ability to let others grow in the light of God, belongs absolutely the trust in the immortality, in the eternity of life. Jesus emphasizes this connection in particular and puts the contrast explicitly into words in this way. The girl, he says, is not dead. She is just sleeping. Under the eyes of God, there is no death. There is, viewed with the eyes of God, only a passage from this world of time and transience over into eternity. But then they laughed at him. On no other Bible passage do we find such cynical and gruesome laughter of self-assured despair as here. But don't we all live like this on average? What interests count for us really? We appear quite certain that in order to live, one must absolutely know how to park a car properly, how to fill out the tax return at the end of the year, how to get one's money, which food one needs in order to follow a doctor-prescribed diet, what medication one must take to make aging easier, and how to make a will. All of this one must absolutely know, in addition to a few small tricks. But whether God exists, that one does not have to know so absolutely. Indeed, one really cannot know it. And it has therefore become rather impolite to say that all of life depends on knowing this, whether God exists or not. In the midst of our cultural business, it would seem embarrassing for someone to say that the only important question in our life is how we position ourselves to God. Questions of this kind are regarded as something altogether relative. The good citizen, another translation would be bourgeois, existence, on the other hand, seems self-assured and self-confident. Is it necessary to emphasize that this appearance is deceptive? In reality, the good citizen or bourgeois existence buys its self-soothing through the cynical mockery against any hope. One might also say in the United States, the term is middle class today primarily. But Drewermann is really not talking about classes. He's talking about basically the idea of just be a good citizen, whoever that would be. So it is necessary to emphasize, is it necessary to emphasize that this appearance is deceptive? In reality, the good citizen existence buys its self-soothing through the cynical mockery against any hope, through the death of life in the midst of life, through the transformation of this world into a tightly sealed sarcophagus. What else then should Jesus do with this whole funeral party than to send it out or to drive it out is translated too nicely. Literally, the Greek says, then he throws them out. It is the end of all accommodation. It is a final, clear break. Jesus takes with him only the parents and 3 of his disciples, as if he gathered himself in the unity of his person against the fatal disease. And again, Drewermann emphasizes that this 3 + 1 number, often, as for instance in fairy tales, let me get this here, is an archetypal schema that describes in fairy tales, in a classical manner, particularly the process of self-discovery. So symbolically, there's something here about Jesus gathering all of his strength. And then the miracle happens. While people's laying hands on the head of a person could be experienced as heavy and as weighty as coercion and pressure, which Jesus doesn't do actually here. He doesn't lay his hands on her. The hands of Jesus touched the hand of this girl from below, who now is a woman, so that she stands up. A wonderful mixture lies in what Jesus says to her. Girl, I say to you, arise. Girl, that means as much as, I understand all your anxiety with which you have been overburdened. I understand all your fear of standing on your own feet. I understand very well how much you have been taught dependency, docility, false obedience, and striving for security. And yet he adds, arise, which means as much as, take the path that you yourself can walk. Arise and determine the direction of your life yourself. And really, the girl walks, literally and independently. Only seemingly does she walk around spatially in this moment. In reality, she is taking the first steps into her own life. But then it is necessary to prevent that this wonderful awakening of a human being to her freedom becomes the gossip of people. And I would just add here that the Greek word that is used typically in biblical translations, stand up, has a connotation of waking up. That's why the word arise is probably a better translation, because that can both mean arise. And in German, the word aufstehen, which Drewermann uses here for getting up, has the same double connotation, to get up or stand up and to get up. Even in English, we can say one gets up, meaning from sleep. So there's a similar connotation, but I think arise might capture a lot of these connotations. So, but then it is necessary to prevent that this wonderful awakening of a human being to her freedom becomes the gossip of people. Miracles like these consist precisely in a person becoming independent of people's opinions. Jesus must therefore expressly forbid making a showpiece for the public out of the healing of this young woman. True miracles of God take place in the heart of people, and that is where they must remain. Only in this quasi-private space of the miracle is it possible to sense the infinity of the divine, and in that to grow fond again of this little life, until the opposites that otherwise separate this world from the next no longer exist. Taught to be free herself, this woman, who henceforth ceases to be Jairus' little daughter, again takes in food. Even and especially this earthly life is not something contemptible. Its few decades are an infinitely precious, eternal good from the hands of God, called to love, called to freedom, called to happiness. This concludes our lecture for today. Thank you for joining in today. If you liked what you heard, please share this video, subscribe to my channel. The next 2 weeks are leading up to Easter, and we will look at Drewermann's revolutionary reinterpretation of the symbols of cross and resurrection, which have been horribly misused throughout the ages by Christianity, unintentionally for the most part, but nonetheless so, to inflict suffering rather than to free people from it. So stay tuned. And I want to let you know that I have broadly interpreted this already in my book, The Violent God Image, an introduction to the work of Eugen Drewermann, which was published by Continuum and is now published by Bloomsbury Publishing. So if you want to get a head start of looking at it, there's actually already some English translation available of some of this. Stay tuned, enjoy your week, and until next week, Saturday. Bye-bye now.